Dzień dobry. Assalamu alaikum. Ciao. Konnichiwa. Guten Morgen. Bonjour. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. It's Ken at 10. How are you today? I hope you're doing well. A few things to talk about today. It's Ask JA Tuesday. And today we thought we'd talk about rent controls because that's in the news because of what's going on in Scotland. And I'll come on to that later on in the broadcast. For those of you that haven't been before, welcome. Thanks for joining us. For those of you returning, thanks for coming back. This is Ken at 10. We are James Alexander Estate Agents. We broadcast daily about all things property from our offices in Norbury, SW16, which is smack bang between Streatham to the north and Croydon to the south. We're a Zone 3 commuting area. We sell and rent properties. How are you today? Hope you're well. Couple of things. First of all, let's report on the weather. Now, the weather. This is bugging me a little bit. You know, Jack and I were discussing this earlier. What is going on? We're seeing all these reports in the press saying that we've got this African plume coming and there's this fantastic weather coming. And then we're looking at all the sites and the apps and seeing that the weather's looking naff for the next week. Well, which is it? Somebody is wrong. We're hoping it's the apps and that the press are right about this African plume coming, because wouldn't it be nice to get a little bit of sunshine before we head to the autumn? But we'll see. If you're wondering why the picture is behind me, then where have you been? It's Paralympics opening ceremony today. Really exciting. You know, we were talking about this earlier and I was saying that one of the things that I love is more than the Olympics is actually the Paralympics, because for me, the great thing about sport is the backstories, you know, and the underdog stories. And the wonderful thing about the Paralympics is that it makes us look at disabled people differently, and it makes us look at them in a way that we think about perhaps the challenges they face, how they got to where they got to, how they come from often adversity, come through that, and now here they are competing for their country. The whole thing I just find so emotive, and, you know, always proud of the British athletes out there supporting us. And, you know, more than that, it's about showing opportunity and awkward discussions around disability and discrimination. So for me, the Paralympics is it. Make sure you tune in. When you get into it, it becomes pretty addictive. And it's the backstories of each of the individual athletes, why they are where they are, some of the terrible things that happened, how they got through that and ended up competing for their country. So looking forward to that. Apart from that, the subject today of Ask JA Tuesday is all about rent controls. And first of all, a headline today in the Daily Mail about tenant demand is saying that it's its highest since 2016, according to landlords. But despite this, an increasing number are looking to sell up. This is the National Residential Landlords Association survey, and it says that its members showed that nearly 39% believe demand increased in the second quarter of 2021, which is hardly surprising, really, is it? And a 5-year high and an 8 percentage point increase on the first quarter. The organisation said it was due to the relaxation of COVID restrictions and a more buoyant economic outlook, which had encouraged tenants to move. However, despite this increase in demand, fewer landlords want to expand their portfolios and more are looking to exit the market altogether. The proportion intending to buy was dropped from 19% in the first quarter to 14% in the second. In comparison, the proportion looking to sell up was 20%, up 3 percentage points. A total of 55% of landlords said their businesses would continue to be negatively affected by COVID. Well, we'll come on to what's going on in Scotland and rent controls and what might happen over here if they're introduced shortly. In other things, we've got the government's starting a 160 million fund about social housing and decarbonisation. That's going to be giving out grants to people to make their places greener, which is a good thing and something that will be interesting to see. Whether that comes through to the private rental sector, we'll see. And on the social side as well, in the Times, they're saying that councils have been given funding to house large Afghan refugee families. The government is giving families a grant to rent or buy large family homes to Afghan refugee families. The Times reports the average size of families coming to the UK for Afghan interpreters and other support staff is 7 people. And so far, local authorities have offered accommodation for just over 2,500 people, but the final number could be almost 5 times that. 1 in 3 councils have come forward with offers of support and providing support for Afghan refugees. So it'd be interesting to see how that goes. I think, you know, it's really awful, isn't it, out there? Really shocking scenes coming out from them. My heart goes out to you if any of your family are connected with that. And I do think that these people have been abandoned by the US and we've had no choice but to retreat to and leave a whole nation at the mercy of the Taliban. Absolutely terrible. Now, let's talk about what's going on in Scotland and rent controls. For some while now, there's been talk of rent controls in the UK. You know, we've had the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, saying that he would like to introduce rent controls. Of course, he has to get that by government, which is unlikely to happen in my view. But even if he did, that's not necessarily something that should scare you away if you're a landlord. And I'll tell you why. First of all, let's look at what's going on in Scotland, because the extremes always seem to happen over there, don't they, with our friend Sturgeon. And the article reads, details are beginning to emerge of the measures likely to be imposed on the private rental sector in Scotland. Headlines over the weekend when the SNP and Green Party struck their deal to create a solid majority centred on rent controls. But the reality is that the reforms go much further. This is in Landlord Today, by the way. We therefore agree, as part of the rented sector strategy, we will create a new housing regulator for the private rented sector to improve standards and enforce tenants' rights. Well, we've heard that before with landlord licensing, haven't we, folks? Been there before. Enhance tenants' rights through greater restrictions on evictions over winter, providing additional security. Introduce rights for tenants, for example, giving them greater flexibility to decorate their homes and keep pets. And put in place additional penalties and compensation for illegal evictions. Well, most of those things good landlords wouldn't really fear anyway. But also it says, following the consultation of the rental sector strategy consultation, we will publish a final strategy and introduce a housing bill. We will also implement an effective national system of rent controls with an appropriate mechanism to allow local authorities to introduce local measures. We will consult on the options, deliver legislation and implement rent controls by the end of 2025. Well, that's in Scotland, of course, not in the rest of Britain. But what's interesting about that is that how are they going to do it? Well, they'll have to, first of all, start with a yardstick, a benchmark. And that has to be the local rents, whatever they are at the moment, the average local rents, because if they set something that is lower than that, then there'll be lots of landlords that couldn't even afford their mortgages, where they've recently acquired buy-to-lets and would need to sell up, further exacerbating the shortage. And you could find a run for the hills, literally, amongst landlords, which would create dead spots wherever these draconian measures are brought in, when it's harsh. So they'll need to do it in a way that is gentle and not too hard, because if they go too hard, then private landlords will vote with their feet and they will just withdraw from the sector, and then the problem will become even bigger. And then I'm not quite sure how you fill that void, because there just aren't the council houses to provide for that space. So what will probably end up happening is that they'll end up saying, right, here are the local rents, and this is the local rent cap, if you will. And then on from there, they would have to link it in some way so that it can increase along with costs. And the way they'll link it is probably towards inflation. Now, rents haven't kept up with inflation. Looking at what's happened locally, if you look at where inflation's been and where it is right now, most landlords haven't been keeping up with those regular rent increases. And what will happen is, if you set rent controls, people will definitely go for the amount of the increase that is provided by legislation, thinking that that's the right thing to do. At the moment, many landlords will let to a tenant and quite often not actually increase their rent for several years. And sometimes when they do increase rents, what many good landlords do is they come to a compromise with their tenants. So for instance, let's say rents have gone up by £150 in the local area. What a good landlord will do is approach their tenants and say, right, we're at the end of the agreement now. New rents are £150 higher. Can we split the difference with an extra £75? Of course, the existing tenant will look out on the rest of the market and see what the landlord says is the truth, and realise that there's a fair compromise there at 50% of the local average rents. A bad landlord, of course, will do the opposite and go for the maximum rental. What will happen is the tenant will probably walk and feel a bit aggrieved and go to another property at the same rent, but nonetheless leave anyway. That's a bit foolhardy, isn't it? The landlord's becoming a busy fool, really. If they'd compromised with the tenant and kept the rent lower, then they would have kept the tenant and the continuity. But what I envisage happening in Scotland is that landlords will go for the increases that are set by government, and therefore rents will slowly increase disproportionately and have exactly the opposite of the intended effect. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But we'll watch Scotland closely, and Nicola Sturgeon. I don't think the government, particularly Boris Johnson, wants to take any lessons from her, but certainly he'll be watching closely, because it is a hot topic. And of course, nobody wants to see rents fly out of control. It's not in anyone's interest. It's not in tenants' interest. It's not in landlords' interest. What we want is a stable market that goes up at a steady pace, but is affordable to everybody and keeps pace with inflation, which is why most landlords invest in buy-to-let in the first place. Is they want a hedge against inflation. You know, if you look at inflation now, it's running somewhere between 2% and 4%, which means that if you've got £100 in the bank, by the end of the year, it's worth £98. If you've got it in property and the rents increase over that time and capital values go up, you're probably looking at more like double or treble that figure. So you're locking down your own future and making sure that that £100 in the bank is worth the same as it was, if not a little bit more. And why shouldn't you protect your family in that way? So the idea that landlords are some sort of pariah and, need to be controlled in this way, I think is misplaced. What we need is more affordable housing and more large-scale rental developments. The difficulty with that is that most of the large-scale rental developments now are being handled by large companies, and those large companies will come along and look to maximize the profit from it because they'll be answerable to their shareholders instead of their conscience. The small landlord, which makes up the majority of landlords in the UK, goes with conscience and therefore tends to be reasonable. There will always be exceptions and there will always be unreasonable people. But in our experience here, with hundreds of landlords locally in the Southwest London area, most landlords don't want to bleed the life out of their rental portfolio. What they want is continuity, stability, and the confidence that their investment is secure and will look after them and their families in the future. And if they look after their tenants, they know that's part of that battle. So that's it for Ken at 10 today. We'll be watching the Scottish model with interest and keep you updated as to what happens there. Apart from that, busy day ahead. And the sun's come out. What about that for the Olympic ceremony? Look, don't forget to tune into the Paralympics. Stay safe, look after your family and friends. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Until then, ciao.